Hello, friends. Today, let us discuss on the history of Old English. History of English has its origin from the Teutonic language. When we study, the history of English, we have to refer to the Germanic people, the tribes of Northern Europe, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They came and occupied the British Islands from 414 AD. Before these people annexed the British Islands, it was under the occupation of the Roman Empire. The Romans occupied or grabbed this land from Celtic people. That was back in 54 BC onwards. Romans established their power and dominated these islands up to 414 AD. And later, these Germanic tribes crept into the island, and as an organized force, under the leadership of Hengist and Horsa, they conquered this island. And these people used to talk four different dialects like Northumbrian, Mercian, Kentish, and West Saxon. So it is from these dialects of Germanic tribes that we find the origin of English. They occupied in different counties of British Island, like the Jutes occupied the Kentish region. Then you have the Angles and the Saxons occupying the Northumbrian and the Mercian area. So we can divide the history of English into three periods: that of Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. The correct segmentation may not be professional or scientific, but at the same time, we can find a certain unique features and characteristics, that are proper to each period. So, in this class, let us talk on the features of Old English. The Old English time or period can be segmented or can be categorized from 700 to 1100 AD. This period extends from the earliest written documents about the close of the 7th century up to 1066. 1066 is the time when there was the Battle of Hastings, and in which the French forces came and occupied England. And this French domination had a very clear-cut, decisive influence on the language and the culture of England. The land of Britain came to be rechristened as England because of the presence of these Anglo tribes. So Anglo-Saxon, it is from Anglo-Saxon. That is the other name for Old English as we study in English literature. So the Old English had many features that are proper to the language of German and Dutch. That is why the sound shift or the consonantal shift that we speak of for Old English can be found in the languages of Dutch and German as well. Whereas French and Latin, they belong to a different family. I think that is of Romance languages. But it's a sprinkling of Latin was there in Old English time also because of the former presence of the Roman Empire in Britain. And also, we know the missionaries, the evangelists came to the land of Britain for the propagation of faith. And as a result, also missionaries also brought a sprinkling of Latin, especially in connection with the religion, church-related, and administrative affairs. Apart from that, Old English was a homogeneous type of language with its own special, unique features, its own vocabulary, its own grammar. And when we come to analyze the various features of Old English, we can find, the stable and a regular pattern of its vocabulary, spelling, and so on. So we come to the features of Old English proper. One is spelling and pronunciation. The Old English had six simple vowels spelled as a, v, u, and I, and probably a seventh one, spelled most likely as ea. It had two diphthongs, aya and ao. At the same time, the length of the vowel determined the semantic or the meaning of word. For example, when you write is with a capital I, that means eyes. Whereas when you write to is with a small I, that has the meaning of is. It had a 16 consonants, but in which was absent. The pronunciation of consonants depended on the phonetic environment. For example, fur. Fur, if it comes in between two vowels, it is considered to be verse sound. But later in Middle English period, we know, the French orthographers and copies, they introduced ver into English, and as a result, they became two separate sounds and two separate alphabets we have. Old English consonants were pronounced most likely in as in modern English, but we can find certain exceptions also. When you have two consonants, written double, the same consonant being repeated, in Old English they used to repeat, pronouncing two separate consonants separately. Uh, so, in short, Old English was phonetic in character, and Old English showed greater consistency and stability with regard to spelling. And also, another thing is, Old English had no silent consonants. When we come to vocabulary, Old English had a homogeneous nature of vocabulary, which are more closely to the vocabulary of languages like Dutch and German. And as I said, many of the historical changes or transitions that took place in Dutch and German can also be traced to Old English. It has an entirely different structure from Latin and French, which belong to another type of family of languages. There was an Anglo Saxon dictionary that contained about 20,000 words, most of which were native words. Only a sprinkling of Latin was there because of the Roman occupation and also because of the activities of the missionaries and evangelists. And also, before the French domination, there was also the attack from the Vikings, the Danish people. And as a result, some of the Scandinavian Norse words also crept into Old English. So we can find some of them. Celtic language also had its presence because Anglo Saxon people preserved many of the original indigenous names of places and localities. So we can find the names of rivers, hills, and places, coming from Celtic language. Something like Kent, London, Avon, Thames, all these things are from Celtic background. Latin contributed some words like cup, cheese, camber, etc. Christian missionaries introduced ecclesial and church related terms. For example, priest, praeost, biscop, bishop, crew for crows, and sanct for saint, and so on. There were also compound words, they were very popular in those days. Well, some examples are Brett Walda, it means ruler of Britain, or Ealdorman, that means a nobleman, or Stormzo, that means stormy sea, are some examples for it. Derivation was also a technique, through which they coined or created new words. There was a prefix B, which means around. So we have words like a bulldon, which means riding around, and also forlorence, with the for as the prefix, which means utter lostness. When we come to grammar, Old English had a very complicated system of grammar, mainly because of the inflectional endings. Grammatical relations were indicated mainly through inflectional endings. In order to understand inflectional endings, actually, we should go to Latin language because Latin, even today, they preserve the inflection. Grammatical relations are expressed through inflectional endings. For example, when you have a word like laudo, I praise. Laudat, it becomes you praise, or laudamus, that becomes we praise. Like lauda with becomes you praise. So it is through that end part, the difference that comes at the end of the Latin words, they express the grammatical relations and changes. Whereas in modern English, we do not have many inflections. Rather, we use prepositions, tenses, tense variations, and conjunctions and other things to express grammatical relations. So this is something very unique with the old languages. So in old English, they did not have all these function words. They used to express the grammatical relations with inflectional endings, just like in Latin and other old languages. There were seven groups of declensions for nouns, and each declension for the noun varied with a slight difference in endings. Then nouns had four cases. Also, gender was really arbitrary. That means they followed grammatical gender instead of natural gender. So what happens is, when we look at the words in old English, it looks really absurd. Because, for example, wife is the word for wife, that is feminine, but another word for wife is wife man, and wife man is masculine. The word for sun is feminine, whereas the word for moon is masculine. Stone is masculine, whereas bank for bench is feminine, because they did not follow that a natural way of categorizing, which we follow today in language. Old English adjectives had two forms, weak form and a strong form. And for weak form, they used to, for example, if the adjective is preceded with a determiner or a demonstrative, that is weak adjective. Whereas a strong adjective stands by itself. Um, so if when there is no determiner preceded, strong adjectives will be used. Comparative was formed by adding ra to the base form, while the superlative had several forms like est, ist, ost, and m. Old English verbs were of two types, weak verbs and strong verbs. The infinitive of verb entered in an, that is suffix, and the present participle ended in e. The past participle had the prefix ge and entered in ed or en. Old English verbs had only two tenses, past tense and present tense. They did not have a future tense. In fact, they used the present tense to express the relations in the future also. Old English syntax was similar to that of modern English, but with certain exceptions. So it is because somewhere due to the greater level of inflections, they had a freer and a more convenient word order, which we do not have in modern English. For example, we can say Rama killed Ravana. You cannot say killed Rama Ravana. It was possible in Old English because just like in Latin, they had a free word order. But that is not possible in modern English because we have fixed the word order and we express the grammatical relations using prepositions and other function words. Then another thing is but this kind of change happened mainly because of fixation of stress on the base syllable. That's a feature that we find in Germanic language. Even before the French infiltration, we can find all the inflectional endings becoming vanishing, or rather getting dropped off from Old English time itself. That was mainly because of the fixation of stress on the base syllable. As when we compare Old English with the modern English, yet another point is, there was no do support in questions and in negatives. Multiple negatives could stack up in a sentence and intensified each other. So this fixation of stress, I come back, that's very important because that made the kind of a turning point in the transition or evolution of this language. Old English with a umpteen number of inflectional endings, began to be weakened, or they got dropped off later, mainly because of this fixation of accent on the base syllable. So stress began to shift to the first syllable of words, and so the endings were not pronounced and began to diminish from the time of Old English itself. The last point in this section is the Old English dialects. There, as I told at the outset, they had a four different types of dialects. And a dialect, it's a regional variant of a language. For example, in Kerala, we have different types of Malayalam. In Trivandrum, we have one form of Malayalam called a Trivandrum Malayalam. But when you go to Kannur, that is a different type, and that is called a Kannur Malayalam. When you come to Trichur, there is yet another form of Malayalam. So these are all different dialects, especially when you draw a map of Kerala with these dialectal boundaries, that is technically called isogloss. So when you come to the Old English dialects, Teutonic settlers from Germany who settled in Britain, they belong to three different tribes. Then their language also represented dialects more or less diverse. Based on the regions of their occupation, we can subdivide or we recognize four distinct dialects in Old English time. Northumbrian, that embraces or that spreads around the district between the Firth and the Humber River in the north. Then you have Mercian, that comes, that the dialectal region comes between Humber River and the River Thames. And actually, this Mercian dialect is very important because that can be considered as the ancestor of modern English. Though in olden days, Mercian was not very prominent or important. In fact, it was West Saxon of King Alfred that was more prominent than Mercian. But West Saxon had no literary successor and it got vanished off. Whereas in the Middle English period, the East Midland, which had its origin from Mercian dialect, became more prominent in London, around Oxford and Cambridge, and that became the precursor to modern English. Therefore, Mercian is a very important dialect. West Saxon is important in Old English time because it was sponsored by King Alfred, who resisted the infiltration of these barbaric tribes from the foreigners or outsiders, and he unified, the British island, and he sponsored literature also, Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and all, all these things about the history. It was sponsored and it was patronized by King Alfred, and he is considered as the father of modern English, in fact. um, yeah, therefore West Saxon was his language, and all the literature was written in West Saxon, so it was prominent in Old English, though afterwards it had no literary successor and it got vanished off or disappeared. The last one is Kentish, spoken in Kent and Surrey, that is in the southeastern portion of the land of the island. Usually, that it was occupied by Jutes. Jutes were the first settlers in Britain, and Kent was the area where they occupied the land. So, of these, Northumbrian and Mercian spoken in the region north of Thames were dialects of the Angles, and they possess certain common features. So, Angles and Saxons, they occupied Northumbrian and Mercian, and that is the northern region beyond River Thames. Then they are together called Anglian. Old English poetry had its beginnings in Anglian, but they were not written down. Actually, it was written down in West Saxon, though there was literature in Anglian language, Anglian dialect. Then West Saxon, which represents the dialect of the Saxons, was the standard language patronized by King Alfred. Kentish is the dialect of the Jutes, who were the earliest of the settlers in the land. we almost to cover the session on the old English period with this. Immediately after this, in the next class we will be talking on the features of the Middle English, especially after 1066. 1066 is an important year with the Battle of Hastings, in which the land, the British island, was conquered by the French forces, and which actually inaugurated a lengthy period of French domination over Britain or England, and which had a profound impact on the culture and life of people on the island. We will meet again in yet another session with a different topic, especially on the Middle English period. Thank you so much.